So welcome Amel, Chiamaka, to this session. So we'll be together for about an hour, and as I was explaining to you, there's about 20 others with us, and these 20 others are a group that's been coming together for the last 4 weeks. This is the 4th week of us coming together, and it's week 4 of 5, and we're kind of, I suppose, coming together each week, gathering and exploring being active for change in different ways. And everybody's affiliated in one way or another with UCD, and this conversation, I suppose, is about bringing some other voices into the space and seeing what the group can also harness from your collective wisdoms, and looking forward to how it unfolds. I might just introduce the 3 of you quickly, if that's okay. So maybe start with Chiamaka. It's really good to see you again, Chiamaka. Lagos born, Galway raised, Dublin based, writer, spoken word performer, arts facilitator, editor, and has been with us in a couple of other events as well. We're really, really glad to have you again. Amel, hailing originally from Algeria, but we've been so lucky to have her with us in Ireland for 20 years, almost 20 years, in community work and youth work, particularly minority ethnic youth and youth experiencing injustice and discrimination, leadership on countless organisations of note, Uplift and ENAR, European Network Against Racism, ones that would be familiar, I'd say, to many. And yeah, describing your practice as transformative and compassionate justice. So really, really glad to have you with us too, Amel. And then Caoimhe, many things as well, just like Chiamaka and Amel. Educator, trainee psychotherapist, documentary filmmaker, a colleague, luckily enough, and 20 years as well, accompanying refugee communities across the world, and folks engaged in migratory journeys, all over the world, and describing herself also as a human rights and social justice activist. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes. One question to kick us off, I was thinking, was how have each of you been? How have you been? Obviously, Caoimhe I see more regularly, but maybe we haven't had this conversation in a while, and I'm just wondering, how has the COVID ride been, and what's been showing up? So maybe just start there, and anyone can kick off. Feel free. Yeah. People are shy.
I know. I give it a go.
Yeah.
So I was like, staring at you. I was just like, can they see that I'm staring at them through the camera?
Yes, surprising.
I think actually it's the question that has been such an odd question since the start of the pandemic, hasn't it? So everybody has been trying to find variations of how are you? Because it's not the usual, 20 years ago when I arrived in Ireland, I very quickly figured out that how are you didn't mean that people really wanted to know how you were. They were just like, it's a greeting. It's like, how are you? And then, yeah, you're grand. But in this time, when you say, how are you? You can't just say, I'm grand. So, we're all trying to tiptoe around the question, and we start our emails a different way and we finish them a different way and all of that stuff. So I think the question is loaded itself. Everybody's just like, bracing ourselves when we hear the question. But I suppose it's, you were talking about what actually has been surfacing, and I think quite a lot of things have been surfacing, but I kind of thought I might share just like the one that's actually the most present with me at the moment, because I different phases. I was here, there, everywhere. And at the moment, the one that's actually really present for me is the, because it just came up in training. So I support a lot of youth workers, educators, community workers, and then grassroots activists or whatever. And in my role of supporting them, there was that idea of actually, oh, so how do we create a space where we can actually get the space where people can talk about how this is affecting them? But it's the first time, I think, ever where everybody is affected by it. Therefore, there's not that outsider who can support you in your thinking and hold space for you to think while you're trying to figure out stuff, because we're all affected. So, you know, usually I can actually take a step back about an awful lot of things. I take a step back, I hold that space, and I go for it, and I'll support you in your reflection. But I'm supporting you in a reflection on something that's affecting you, but that's affecting me too. And there's no one on this planet that's not being affected. So there's no one that can take that step back to give us the, you know what I'm trying to say? So that's what I'm trying to figure out at the moment. It's like, how are we showing up for each other when we don't necessarily have the space to be in a neutral space, to be able to be there for each other? So that's where the reflections I'm having at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that, Amel. Yeah, it is. I agree. It is a loaded question. It's been a pretty hefty cultural shift, as you said, from, you know, how are you, or, you know, how are you, being a very sort of, you know, we can say shallow greeting. You sort of do a hi bye, but now it requires a lot of thought, because you don't want to trigger other people, um, you know, with your own sort of thoughts. And perhaps you're in a valley, and someone might be having their peak day, and you don't want to bring them down. So yeah, it definitely requires a lot more compassion and a lot more sensitivity. Yeah, it's become a very complicated question. Yeah, I think for me today, every day is different. My partner is a little bit unwell, and I'm a little bit unwell as well. So it's kind of been a struggle to try and take care of him and take care of myself as well, and while we both work and try and sort of keep ourselves cheerful, and stay positive. So yeah, it's been a struggle, but also recognize how blessed I am. Like my work over in virtual mediums, in a way that a lot of people's can't, and so I think economically I've been very lucky. So yeah, I think I'm fine. Thank you for asking.
I'd say similarly to both Amel and Chiamaka. And it's such a privilege and a luxury, I think, in a way, of just sharing this space with you two, with you, Sive, with all of you whom we can't see, but we know are there and here in all of your different ways of how are you and of being within this. But I really resonate with, in a way, maybe as someone whose migratory journey was different, in the sense of my parents immigrated out of Ireland, so we grew up all over the place, and then I lived sort of my formative and adult years in Latin America and the Middle East, primarily in a variety of different countries. But I probably, similarly to you too, I've always had that dissonance around that question in Ireland, you know, how you doing? What's the crack? You know, and I've never known how to answer that, because I've never really been sure, you know, even though this is my country of origin, it's one in which, you know, I've spent less time living here than probably most other places that I've lived in my life. So in a way, over the past few months, ironically, I felt more at home here. because the tone and the registers of conversations has gone deeper. And I think the things that I've always loved about Ireland, in terms of, I think, that capacity to care in crisis, people might not do that the depth or the nuance of that emotional sort of connection in the immediacy of the now, but in times of crisis, there's always community in times of death and celebration and love. So I think I spent quite a few years when I moved here, when I had my little boy, of in a way being physically here, but being very much in the context of war, that I had sort of, and not just war, also celebration and joy and creative, I think, potentiality of the communities that I worked with, but also a lot of suffering, and a lot of violence, being visited upon them. So I spent a lot of years when I came here of never quite feeling fully at home, and always feeling sort of that a part of myself hadn't come back into sort of a place of social peace, and a part of my heart was very much, in the immediacy of the crisis of what continues. And so it's been a struggle over the last few months, in the sense that part of me now feels more at home, because people are talking about mortality. They're talking about a death. They're talking about mental health. They're talking about, emotional and spiritual health, maybe in a way that there wasn't that same freedom space around. But I'm also hugely conscious of, again, as mentioned, the privilege of, I've gone back to do clinical hours now, because the service, that I'm working within is deemed sort of an essential service. But for months I wasn't, it was all online. And I was very conscious of, in other contexts, sort of humanitarian response or social justice or rights-based responses, maybe I would have been part of that front line. And here my skill set became redundant, which was interesting to sit with, bar sort of, first responder training, what could I offer? So it's that, and then the moments in which it's been really hard to be here and not there, because of suddenly the hypermobility that we had taken for granted, and never taken for granted conceptually, politically, but certainly, the ease in which, if the fire in Moria that raised the camp was burning, one could get on a plane and go and participate in that response with all of the privileges of the citizenship, that I hold. But then, and I'm thinking of you here, Amel, thinking about the explosion in Beirut, our friends and our comrades and the people that we love in that context. And, the only way that we've been able to sort of walk with people has been through these, sort of missives of knowing, that there's no right thing to say in that context of desolation, and of the trauma, the multiple traumas that came in the aftermath of that explosion. Yeah, so I suppose like both of you, Amel and Chiamaka and Sive, and probably everybody on here, I sort of skate in and out of different places. And there's part of me that recognizes that maybe I shouldn't be as okay as I have been within this, in the sense that I don't want to diminish in any way the difficulty, the claustrophobia that so many people have navigated around this. But I think I hold it in a context of, when you've lived through war in any capacity, I think one thing that it does is resource you with a lot of adaptability. And that I've seen in this, when you're used to living with curfews, or used to living with insecurity, or the threat potentially of violence, being inflicted upon the communities that you're accompanying by choice. It shifts perspectives, it shifts priorities, and it shifts, I think, the immediacy of being able to love spontaneously and deeply, because I think there's an awareness of how ephemeral, life really can be. But I'm also really conscious from my mental health perspective, in terms of, what I'm training in, that it has been a time of a lot of anxiety and overwhelm, and different ways of grieving, amongst so many people. And I think that really has to be resourced and valued and honored and responded to, in a much more holistic way than it is, health that is integrative.
You mentioned there, Caoimhe, a couple of things that have happened in the year that happened and that are obviously entangled with COVID, but happened with COVID, if you know what I mean. So I was thinking about how COVID has been a companion to us this year, thinking of companion not as necessarily like a friend or a comfort, but just something that's with us, and maybe not showing signs of going away. But at the same time, things continue to happen, right? Things continue to happen. And things have happened in our year, and I know, you were signaling a couple of happenings there in what you were saying. And I was wondering, they're entangled with COVID, but at the same time, they're part of past and ongoing kind of injustices and systems. And I'm wondering, what's been reverberating for you in this year, acknowledging that the entanglement of things that have been going on with COVID, but things that have been happening this year on the planet, and whether new sense has been made of those things, or we have a new feeling about them or perspective on them, again, that we might not be able to disentangle from COVID, but what would some of those happenings be for any of you that you would signal and maybe talk about a little bit? I'm not sure if that makes sense. It's hard to pull things out. So not wanting to disentangle, but to also acknowledge things that keep going on, and what's reverberated.
I think certainly, as we saw in June of this year, after the murder of George Floyd in America, it's sort of that sense of racial injustice and the need for the continuation of that fight for racial justice sort of reverberated across Europe, across the world, and very much was significant response here in Ireland, especially in Dublin. That was an event, an experience that was certainly, I think, probably made possible because of COVID, because of the pandemic, because of the mass unemployment, because of the new levels of poverty that communities have been plunged into, especially migrant communities and ethnic minorities. And the response from white people, definitely a larger amount than in Black Lives Matter as a movement was originally created and formed and started. So a sort of twofold. It's also a solidarity that was definitely new and was appreciated. We saw people who may not have personal experience, but were choosing to go out and protest because they recognize that we are all responsible for each other. I think that's what the pandemic has taught us, and it's that sort of virtue or value, that civic duty, has been ingrained in people's minds and sort of fed into a response to movements like Black Lives Matter. And then more recently, the End SARS movement in Nigeria, my country of birth. We saw on the 21st of October, the military massacre of peaceful protesters who were protesting against the special anti-robbery squad, which is a band of sort of police officials who have been wreaking havoc and who have been brutalizing citizens and who have shown a total disregard for human life and for dignity of persons in Nigeria, and who have compounded all sorts of existing sort of social inequalities and discrimination. So we see targeting young men and accusing them of theft or of fraud just because they dress a certain way, just because they show, you know, the sort of minimal luxuries like iPhones and etc. And targeting women as well, you know, gender gender-based violence is something that is a massive problem, we saw a movement rape in Nigeria. We saw a movement as well during the summer. So I think these movements are tied to the pandemic because really just we have time. People have time. People are not distracted. It's like we sort of have nothing to lose now. You know, no one's gonna fire you. You're already fired, or you're already redundant, or you know, you're not getting paid anyway. So you might as well go out and protest for your rights. Yeah, so I think definitely the pandemic has increased our sense of social responsibility and of social justice, and I suppose how far we're willing to go, and made us realize the sort of cracks in our systems that were pre-existing, but that we were perhaps willing to ignore just to be able to get our daily bread and to feed our families. So yeah, it's the last few months. You know, it was Nigerians' 50th Independent Day on the 1st of October, and then merely 20 days later, we see the government sending military personnel, sending the army to shoot at peaceful protesters, and you really just see that. And then we see lots of injustice exposed in the fact that several governors have been hiding health and food supplies in warehouses that were meant to be distributed to their communities. They've been hiding them for their own profit and for their own enjoyment. And it's like, maybe if there weren't those protests and if people weren't sort of pissed off to the point where they're willing to leave their house in a pandemic, willing to risk their life, maybe these things wouldn't be exposed. Maybe even if they were exposed, maybe we wouldn't be so desperate to see justice. But it's sort of now or never kind of mentality, which honestly floored me. I suppose when you kind of growing up in a very corrupt society, in a very corrupt leaders, you definitely get used to it, and you get used to people getting away with things from the top down, and to see a fervor in my fellow Nigerians, see them ask, demand the things that they have a right to, demand their rights, and demanding human dignity, which we shouldn't have to ask for. Everyone should have these simple things. But I guess it's not so simple in some places. But yeah, it definitely, I don't know if the distance from home made it worse, But honestly, once again, we speak about privilege. Even though, you know, I have family in Nigeria and I was very worried about them, and I just wanted to support them in any way I can, including protesting at the Dublin, Nigerian embassy in Dublin. I still recognize that, you know, I'm not the one who has to, you know, cooperate with just incredibly badly thought out curfews in a city of, you know, millions of people trying to make their way home before a curfew that, you know, some people are still working by that curfew. So, but yeah, what am I saying? Yeah, the distance, you want to be there with your family, but you also recognize that you can probably do more good by supporting them with whatever resources you have here. Sorry, just gotten lost in my own mind. But I think that the pandemic has definitely shown me that when worse comes to worse, people demand their human rights, regardless of the consequence. People's lives they shouldn't have. But what I've been hearing from activists is that these are sort of the requirements for revolution. That blood is often spilled, blood is often shed. Like martyrdom is, I suppose, is the price to pay. It shouldn't be, but it is. And I think that's mirrored in our experience of COVID-19 as well. So thousands of people have died. A lot of whom were just taking care of other people, a lot of whom were healthcare workers like my mother. And you know, they really do risk their lives just for their fellow human beings. And I don't know anything more noble than that. And I don't know how people in power can not acknowledge just the level of importance that healthcare workers play in our society as essential workers, and have them be compensated fairly for that work. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Chiamaka. I think there's a few things that you said, and some of the things that Caoimhe you said as well, kind of connected. There's a couple of things I think, like for me, what's been unfolding or what's been happening on this planet kind of got me to deeply reconnect and rethink my activism. But you know, because like Caoimhe was talking about, that kind of being able to jump on a plane and go when something happened, or you know, like you were referring to Beirut, and just my friends just sending me videos and just and actually just ringing each other and just staying in silence because they had nothing to say, and there was nothing I could say, because usually what we do is we go and we hold them physically, we sit with them in silence and we hold them, and we couldn't do that. So there was like, okay, so what is my role here? And there's something about as well connecting with for a very long time in Ireland that was undocumented. So, you know, again, referring to what Caoimhe was saying, when you have the experience of civil war, the experience of that hardship, being undocumented for a very long time meant that I could not leave the country and couldn't see my family. So that actually, there was a bit of that. There was a bit of an aftertaste of reminding me of being stuck and not being able to have access to. So that then you develop skills, you know, you develop things to kind of, that resilience help you along the way. So I kind of had to tap into that. I had to go back to that space that wasn't a really nice space to be in at all, and kind of going, now I should be able to travel, but I can't. And I can't be with my loved ones, and I cannot be with my family, and your support network isn't there. So that we were actually talking about it just before the start of the call, actually. That's why I relocated in a place where I had more family and access to more family, because it's just like being on your own and not having your social network and your family in times, you know, like that where you really need them. It's kind of, you really feel it. So what Chiamaka was talking about, that kind of like they're at home and you're here and you're trying to follow what's going on there. So I think that dimension as well of, you know, when you're part of a diaspora, you connecting with how this is affecting all these different countries. So I wasn't just living COVID in Ireland. I was living in Algeria, I was living it in France, I was living it in Lebanon, I was living it in the US where my friends are, I was living it in so many different countries where you have family and loved ones, but like even just the family, because we, you know, when there's migration or immigration, usually a lot of, you know, your siblings or cousins or whatever are all over the world. So you're hearing the death count in all these countries. You're hearing how the curfew is affecting every person in all of these countries. So you're kind of in this multiple verse of how COVID is actually influencing the life of everybody, and in some circumstances kind of hard others. So it's like how you negotiate all of that. And I think it kind of really got me to, I think the one thing that really helped me through that and kind of just grounded me was to figure out my role. And it wasn't what I wanted to play, what was the role I wanted to play, was the role I could play realistically. So what is it that I had around me resource wise, in mainly because that's like, you know, you have the technology, but then it's kind of those resources inside that, and how could I use them in a way that would be helpful. But and rethinking if I can't rush, if I can't jump in a plane, if I can't organize a fundraiser, if I can't do all of the stuff that we usually do, and you know, it's like, I think that additional, I kind of share, you know, I would be considered in the high risk category. So even when people were able to go in the street to protest, I still couldn't. So, you know, it was just like that kind of frustration of kind of, okay, I have to really figure out how I'm doing this. And I think it's, yeah, it's like whatever compassion you're ready to put out there, it's like that self-love, I think is, yeah, it's a radical love, and showing it to yourself, going like, I need to show that to myself so that I have the space and the space in my heart to be able to be there for people that really need me as well. So it's kind of, yeah. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is just the experience of like, you know, we all, you know, like, Chiamaka, you mentioned the cracks, and those cracks have been there for a very long time. And it's not as if like, you know, as if it's news to us that there's a whole system that's collapsing. But I have to say, I didn't think that within 6 months, like how much of like a quicksand, like the whatever equality and justice systems that we were supposed to have built, like within 6 months, they, like just in Ireland, look at how the impact of like the disparity of equality issues, the massive gap that kind of just is so brutally in your face within 6 months. I thought we would be able to kind of, you know, push it at least for like 2 years or something. 6 months, an absolute collapse of a system that was supposed to be there to support people. Suddenly there's like, you know, and you see it, and people that don't have access, they don't have access 10 times more. And kids going back to school in September, like the teachers going, well, this kid, it's going to take me a very long time to catch them up to where this kid is at. And it's just how in 6 months could equality or whatever we work towards collapse so quickly. So even though like I'm you know, I'm not so well, I'm actually surprised at the speed. I'm not surprised at all it collapsed, but I'm surprised at how fast it happened. And yeah, that whatever was built on quicksand. So yeah, so that's a little bit of my thoughts on that.
Similarly, when you're referring, I think the metaphors are really interesting here, you know, in the sense of well, the quicksand in terms of like that sucking down, but also those cracks that you refer to, Chiamaka, and then, you know, the potentiality for hope that comes, you know, within those, because you can see more clearly oftentimes. And within that, I was thinking of, in the context, actually a poem came to mind when you both were speaking, by Naomi Shihab Rai, who is a Palestinian American poet, and she wrote this poem ages ago that refers, it's talking about kindness and grief, and she talks about the accompaniment of grief and trauma vis-a-vis justice oftentimes, or sort of that reaching into the social justice position, and she refers to the end of the poem like, you know, grief almost being shadow and being friend. And in a way, it's almost like this register that I think we've all collectively navigated. I'm sure everybody, you know, on this call in various different ways has been a constant. And I'm thinking, and I'm going to connect this in a minute to the meta and to, you know, the global, but I'm thinking on a personal basis, like that register for grief, that's been the thing actually that has really come up in the pause as well. And by grief, it's not, you know, it's not low mood, it's not overwhelm, but it's having, you know, the tangible time to grieve so many people, so many friends, so many comrades, so many colleagues, you know, so many quote unquote strangers, you know, in the context that I've borne witness in their very violent deaths. And in a way, I was thinking pre the pause, you know, as a single parent juggling 2 jobs and studies and, you know, constant solidarity sort of commitments, I held the accompaniment of that grief, but I didn't have time to go into it. And it's been a really interesting process of like, you know, because my dreams are all dreamscapes from all of these different, you know, markers in my life. Like I spent my teenage years in Zimbabwe in a post-colonial context, you know, of navigating that political, you know, awakening as a 14-year-old of reading Frantz Fanon, and, you know, that collective process of really amazingly, you know, presciently sort of wise friends that I had the good fortune to sort of fall in with, or Haiti or Mexico or Guatemala or, you know, Palestine, Syria, and all of these junctures, you know, along the way of loss, you know, whether that was friends being killed, whether that was people, you know, being kidnapped and then assassinated, and, you know, things that in a way I had normalized. And it's only, I've started to write because I had to do this dissertation on hyperspeed over the past month to try and churn it out because I left it until the last minute. But in that process of like actually writing, you know, I was reflecting on like, I gave birth to my son, you know, 2 days after an extremely close, like a brother, friend, you know, soul comrade was kidnapped and assassinated. And I watched that video, you know, before I went into labor. And in a way, it feels like life has always been there. And it almost feels like, you know, now that we're in this context of there's no distracting people anymore, or maybe there's temporary distractions, and temporary distractions can be good. I'm very much promoting self and collective care here as well. If people need to bake bread, if people need to watch Netflix and, you know, have family, you know, bingo WhatsApps and do all of that beautiful, you know, soul enhancing things, that to do that and to value that, I think, is an act of resistance in itself, right? It's creating joy, it's creating community, it's creating, and then alongside that, it's the death, I think, in a way that in our context of comparative extreme privilege, you know, and I'm not saying that there isn't huge disparity and huge inequality in Ireland and so many other contexts, but I'm thinking vis-a-vis that proximity to death. And when I think of big seminal moments, definitely Black Lives Matter. And I remember being on a demonstration in Dublin, and it was, I mean, I was, you know, amongst 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds, and this power and this beauty and rage and pain and joy. And it was literally like I've been going on demonstrations forever, it seems, sometimes feels like, and sometimes they just feel very formulaic and performative and lacking in spirit, you know, really lacking in spirit, lacking in emancipatory freedom seeking spirit. And this wasn't, it was so visceral and it was so real. And the platform, you know, that organically created itself was so much more representative, you know, of, I think, that discourse that goes beyond the polemic, you know, than we're so used to seeing in demonstration sort of contexts of sort of the same old predictable faces, you know, and line and it was vulnerable. There was this this vulnerability that was given permission to exist within that. And it was really profound. And so I'm thinking of it in the sense of like when you stop not seeing, and it almost felt like the permission that was given, to that multiplicity of experiences of racism in Ireland. I'm thinking in the Irish Times magazine that Emma Dabiri and others, wove together, because it was such a weaving of narrative, and all of those stories that were coming out, whether that was in media, whether that was in WhatsApp chats, but of oftentimes teenagers speaking to these profoundly painful experiences that there hadn't been space to speak to or speak of. And then on another level, the deaths of a lot of the communities that we work with seeking refuge. And some of that dissonance that I've been sitting with over the last few days, and I really resonate with what you're saying, Amel, in terms of like when you no longer have, identity around a role of, okay, this is what I can do, this is whatever social capital I have amongst my friends and comrades, that we can put out a word, mobilize resources, get a convoy together, respond, be there. We can't be there. And it really struck me over the last few days, vis-a-vis the tens of thousands of invisibilized deaths that continue to go on in the Mediterranean, of the 6-month-old baby Joseph and his mom, and all of those preventable deaths that are so, have such direct causality with EU policies of racism, of externalization of borders, of invisibilization of death, that witness in a way which is confined these days because invisibilized and so outsourced, and that back to Libya, but on those ships, that suddenly people had to sit with the enormity, of the relentless violence of these border regimes. And if anything, and it's not to say, because I think in a way the pandemic and the pause, in some ways has fueled the right, it's fueled fascism, these borders, but it's also fueled, I think, people understanding the urgency, of what we're talking about. So it's not abstract, anymore. When you're talking about death in the context of people seeking refuge, it's tens of thousands of life, and whether that's in the Sonora Desert, whether that's in the Mediterranean Sea, whether that's people dying of hypothermia, trekking across a balcony, trying to cross the channel, or, these multiple are dying while trying to access lives, of stability, of the most basic of rights, as well as dignity and meaning and potentiality of hope, of building. But it's brutal. And in a way it feels like, people are sitting maybe a little bit more with that brutality. And whether it's manifested vis-a-vis the massacre in Lagos, whether it's manifested vis-a-vis all of these forms of state oppression, that are being visited out upon people in different contexts, whether it's visited, through the violence of austerity or the violence, of economic injustice that you're right, Emma, like, has been so more exposed, whether it's exposed through the health workers that you referred to, Chiamaka, your mother, and so many others who are on the front line of this response, who we all applaud, and then when it comes to when they're striking and when they're fighting for their rights and when they're advocating, for justice, that they don't receive that same level of societal support. But so within that, it feels like, sometimes the cracks it feels like it can be a space, of transformation. And I'm not thinking utopic here, like, thinking a big systemic fundamental revolutionary change, but at the very least, conversations about justice or rights not being sort of an addendum to something else, people not sort of, and I've experienced this on a personal level, when I run into people, instead of, and with genuine intent, it existed pre-pandemic, people saying, oh, how are people in Moria, or, how are people navigating this, but it feels like because people have more time to sit, with the pain of others, potentially, as well as their own, that maybe something is shifting. And in a way, maybe it's too much to ask of people in the immediacy of now, if they are, navigating anxiety, overwhelm, or low mood, or claustrophobia around the sort of enclosure in a lockdown. But I think post-lockdowns, post all of this, what is the material that we have to collectively work with? What will people not want to return to in terms of the frenetic ridiculously stressful paces of their lives pre this. What are people prepared to compromise, and what are they prepared not to compromise? What are the red lines in terms of solidarity? And that, I think, is going to be the time, in which everybody on this call and many, many others, in whatever way we can engage with these issues, whether that's one-on-one conversations, or actually participating in different ways, around systemic change, really has a part to play. Because the system isn't working, and we know that. The system is brutalizing people. The systems are brutalizing people on so many different levels, and it feels like there's some potential to really just look at that with honesty and integrity and bravery, for people to be braver maybe than they thought they could be as well. Sorry, that was way too
long. I knew it would be like this. I knew we'd start. You three would start, and then there'd just be all these, and then we could maybe sit here for hours and unpick all the things that you're shedding light on. And it feels like sometimes for me it's like that there's so many tensions, there's things going on, and they're intent. When I say tension, I don't mean tension about, but they're it's like, or maybe more tuned to the way in which more than one thing is going on. There's this, even in a given day, given moment, there's something about that that hints at the potentiality and the hope and the cracks. But at the same time, it feels enormously heavy, and things that we didn't want to look at maybe seem a bit more visible. So anyway, I'm also thinking about how some of the questions that I'd written down were kind of as if none of this was happening, as if like these questions are questions I might have asked you last year, as if there's just a continuity in our practice. And yet what you're showing is that things have really shifted for you and for the people around us and for the systems which we navigate in myriad of ways. So there was one kind of area, and it maybe there's a way to link it in with what you've all been saying. It was just in your bio, Amel, you write about processes that can enable grassroots voices to sit in their power and impact political discourse, and it just really caught me. It sent goosebumps my arms, and I wondered if you could speak some more about that, and then others as well come in. This idea of people sitting in their power and then impacting political discourse. It seems so pertinent in light of what you've been saying, all of you, and also in light of what's been going on the last few months. So I'll be over to you to begin.
Thanks, Sive. I think, it's like when, you were mentioning that at the very beginning, in terms of my practice, I believe in transformative justice and transformative and compassionate justice. And, I'm more of a fan of the terminology around transformation rather than change. It's kind of like, I think there's an aspect of, there's something about transformation that actually involves you evolving and growing, and whatever you transform to, there's always a bit of you still there. Whereas with change, I don't know, maybe it's just the terminology or the words, and I think it's actually really true my lived experience and as an activist, from being the shouty, angry activist who thought that by doing that I was going to heal my wounds, to and that the healing needed to happen, and real deep trauma healing needed to happen, and that actually, I couldn't fight and heal at the same time, and that actually maybe healing was my fighting. And through those processes, I think there was so much learning there that I kind of then saw how facilitating processes for other people, and mainly young people and grassroots organizations and women and young people in particular, there was something for me that actually clicked when I reclaimed my power. So there was this idea for a very long time. I used to say I'm powerless. They took my power when I was undocumented, I was an asylum seeker. You know, when you receive your deportation order, there's that moment where you read that letter and you're like, I have zero power. They took it all. To actually getting into another space where you go, no one took anything. It was always here. No one can ever take my power. It's in here. It might be the light kind of is probably really dimmed and I might not see it anymore because it's covered with a lot of crap. But it's my healing process is about clearing that crap until I see that light again, because no one can take that away from me. And kind of really starting to really dive into the understanding of power and just going, why are we associating power with our notion of power over? Basically, it's the control, the coercion, the violence. And we think, you know, so very often, like if I do a workshop, for example, and I'd say, think of someone powerful, and people are going to kind of give examples of like scary people, you know, and then they'll talk about their mother and they'll say, oh no, she was strong. So we're strong and they're powerful. And then the shift for me was like, no, we're powerful. They're powerful. They use their power over, but I'm powerful as well because I use my power within to influence change. So that was such a huge journey for me, that actually being able to facilitate that with other people is actually a really very empowering process itself. But kind of just like that moment when you click and you go, no, I'm not powerless. It's a feeling. I might feel powerless, but I am not, and no one can take my power away. And I think I see that so for example, like let's say in terms of racial justice, when I work with young people of color, because, you know, like in terms of deciding what role we play, I think, you know, I kind of, I do rely on a lot of my allies to do that piece of work of the challenging of the far right and the racism and white supremacy, and just in terms of like the comrades in arms, like Caoimhe for me would be an ally that I know I don't even have to worry about. I'd be like, okay, she's taken that front. I can actually deal with something else. And I think I recognize my role as being very present for my community. So kind of spending an awful lot of energy trying to figure out how I can protect myself while I'm fighting white supremacists. I was like, too much hassle. How do I want to use my energy? I'm going to ask my allies to do that fighting. And I'm going to use that to organize and support the healing of my communities, because we are hurt, and we will not be able to fight back or survive if we don't do our healing. And if we actually do a fighting from a hurt place, that's actually hurting us even more. But if we do our fighting from a healed place, and a place that's actually really sitting in our power, and it's coming from our hearts and collectively and individually, that fight is a completely different type of fight, because then we're more about protecting ourselves and building ourselves, about being there for each other and trying to change the system. And it's not kind of a one-to-one kind of, I'm not interested anymore by whatever you're doing in the far, interested in how we're building beauty and healing within our own communities. And I think when I see, especially like, let's say, groups of young people who are able to articulate what the different dimensions of racism, and that racism is not just an individual experience, that it's structural, it's institutional, it's historical. When you can actually connect and find the language around what's going on for you, when that internalized racism has just made so much damage but you still can articulate and go, actually, that's what's going on. And that's why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. And when someone kind of whatever kind of argument comes up, especially when you're a young activist or young leader, and you're able to articulate your truth without trying to justify or explain, I'm just going to articulate my truth. You do whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me. There's that real power, I think. So that's what my process is of getting that voice out there. Like for me, anyway, it's I think there's something about, I think Caoimhe was mentioning that that another form, like, you know, resistance is creating beauty as well. And the outcomes in organizing as well is another thing that I shifted in terms of power and understanding that power within. Is my outcome is not that when we organize or we have a meeting is that we're going to get whatever we're fighting for. The outcome is that we showed up and we were together and we were able to provide a space for each other, and we created beauty by just even disagreeing or being brave with each other, or like kind of really deeply challenging each other. But we did that, and we decided how we wanted to be together in that space. And I think that creating that collective beauty is my outcome now. It changes everything. You know, there's a lot less burden of changing the world on your shoulders. You're not like, I don't have to change all of this. I actually just there's Margaret Whitley is someone that I have a lot of respect for, but she talks about creating islands of sanity, and it's about let's create our little islands of sanity. That's how you influence structural change.
And for Chiamaka and Caoimhe, these islands of sanity or these places of practice, where are they for you?
I love that. I love the it's something that, even though I hadn't didn't have the term for it until now. Thank you, Amel. I think I've always been invested in creating islands of sanity, and it's only this year that I've kind of gotten over this sort of accusation in my own mind of like being selfish. I've always been deeply invested in self-preservation, deeply invested in safety, in safe spaces, in just security and feeling safe, like over and beyond sort of everything, because I'm highly sensitive, and I find that I can become so overwhelmed with daily living, and then when you throw the complexities of, you know, of identity politics and like social injustice onto daily life, sometimes I just can't cope. And I've been lucky that I've always had my writing as a place, a place of solitude, a place of journey into reconciliation, a place of investing in healing, which often takes time. And I think because of the pressures of life and of, you know, societal expectations, I've sometimes chosen other things above pursuit of safety and security and healing, and spiritual wellness. And I think this year has still been a turning point for me in regards to deciding to say, you know, to hell with everything else, and really affirm myself in that practice that I've always had, but without beating myself up for it, and really evaluating how it is that my work, you know, functions in terms of social justice, in terms of like collective healing and communal, just communal healing, and just really kind of repeating to myself that, you know, I have to be well before I can help someone else be well. And I've always struggled to come to terms with that, come to terms with creating my own island of sanity. And there's lots of insanity in my life, in my community, in society. And I've always been so sensitive to it, and so porous to it, and the damages that it causes. But this year has definitely shown me that we need our islands of sanity, and that allyship really is about, like, it's about doing the work for the people who can't, who do the work every day, and it's like they get to take a day off and you fight for them. And I've kind of realized that the people who aren't willing to do that for me and my community I don't want those people around, because life is so precious and so short, and so so easily kind of taken away from us. And so if someone's not committed to making life good for as many people as possible, and healing themselves and healing their community, then then our values don't align.
I was thinking, listening to you both, that I'm so glad you journeyed us into this place, Emma, because I was really conscious on a personal level in my last intervention, or yeah, that I was very focused on grief and heaviness and pain. And I'm really conscious that in this room collectively we have almost 20 people who are engaged in this work, who are emerging into this work, who are questioning, who are probing, who are finding their capacities and registers and their attunement and their this work. And so before you began, Amel, I was like, oh no, just talk about joy, and not in a performative or an instrumentalist way. There's also much joy in this work, in this journey. And I think oftentimes, and it really resonated with something that you were talking about, Chiamaka, in the sense of when you're in exile or a diaspora, oftentimes when you can't be there, it's sometimes, in my experience of witnessing friends who have navigated it, for them sometimes has been so much harder, because if you're there, you've made a decision, you take sacrifices and you're part of a collective. But when you're outside, it can be really, really hard. But when you're there in the context, I think, whether there is here, in the sense of in Ireland, organising and responding and building community, and, I'm thinking of Gareth here, land-based movements, movements that are regenerative and, restorative in a different way, that root and ground us and allow for those branches, of hope and potential to emerge. But within it, there is so much joy. And it can be hard, I think, to convey to people sometimes, that when, in a way, people face their own mortality with all of the vulnerability that entails, to recognize the fragility of life, the fragility of our lives, and that is very much influenced, and mediated by power and privilege in terms of how fragile is that life. But yet in a pandemic where anything regarding the humility of the body, it becomes clear to everybody in varying different degrees. But within that, there, when I think back to the last, 25 years, give or take, of involvement as a young teenager in this, that sources and those well springs of hope and joy and celebration and food and dance and music, and common purpose. I think there is a comfort, and not in the echo chamber sort of sense, of that everybody has to be each other's, way of articulating and way of expressing, the same shared sort of values. But when it comes to the values around freedom and justice and dignity, it's really, in a way, a luxury, I find, to have up until now, to have had that hypermobility, that an unearned mobility and unearned privilege that my passport has afforded me, to bear witness, to accompany, to live for big stretches of time amongst people who have taught me so many lessons, vis-a-vis, what it means to place the collective, around the individual, right? So the individual is valued within that, and there is a focus also on self-care, but the collective oftentimes holds the individual within that as well, which in a way is harder in the context that we operate here, where things are more atomized. But on a personal level, in terms of the island of sanity and refuge, I think in my own heart and soul and psyche, it's in a way having a child. It keeps you very grounded, I find, and in the immediacy of joy, and discovery and innocence and emergence into the world, the sea always, and then community. And that, in a way, I think if there has been anything on a personal level that has been hard throughout this, it's, that desire, as you mentioned, Amel, to hug, to be in presence, to have the physiological register of warmth, of empathy, of responsitivity. So that's been a process, but it's really, in a way, and I remember reading, something about sort of, just sort of the clenched fist. But I almost find, for me, when I think of sort of emancipatory change, it's not a clenched fist. It's an open heart. It's leaning into grief, but it's leaning into vulnerability, and then it's leading into joy, and it's leading into hope, and it's holding space for all of that concurrently, and recognizing, in a way, I don't really think one can exist without the other. They're all there. They're all part of that mix. But certainly, from somebody who's witnessed the fallout when people don't make that conscious decision, I think specifically affected communities who are on the receiving ends of all of the layers of racism, all of the layers that discrimination entails in terms of that spiritual pain. If that is not prioritized, if it isn't valued, that care, of your internal ecosystem, that allows you to speak to that external, it can be really, lonely and isolating for people. So for any and all of you, I think, in this room, if you can develop your own practices, whether that is, I think, engaging in the hope-filled spaces, and the spaces of gravitas that people like Amel and Chiamaka build, if it can be, through just a daily practice, but there has to be intentionality around it. Because if not, I think with the speed and the urgency of what we all sort of respond to, it's so easy for that to be, goes down to the bottom of the list of priorities. And then there's the shame of, like, I think about my boundaries, when the communities I'm working with, can't access. And, as Chiamaka really rightly pointed out, if we're not doing this work from a place of wellness, health, balance, from a place, but they're also really deep. And I'm thinking here of the nervous system, when we're dysregulated, and occupying, a physiological embodied space with others, there's registers that go beyond the cognitive, and it's really worth just doing the work on ourselves in tandem with the work that we do in the collective, to honor both. And in a way, to have the humility to recognize that we all have our limits of endurance, of emotional endurance, psychological, spiritual, and yeah. But yeah, I'm very grateful that you both journeyed us into this place, because I think there needs to be understanding, if there can be as well, that for all of the hardships that witness of injustice can entail in terms of spiritual and emotional pain, there's also just amazing beauty, in the communities that refuse to be invisibilized, that refuse to accept, oppressive, dominant power, but that reclaim their own.
It's funny how you how you began and then finished also with this idea of joy. Because I came across a quote this morning, something Yvette Dion had written. She's a writer, an American writer, also known across the internet as Free Black Girl. And I think talking for, to herself and to the Black community in America possibly is the context for this. And it just, it leads on a little bit from what you just said there, Caoimhe. So she said, joy is a revolutionary force. We need it as much as we need anger, because it is joy that will help keep us in these bodies long enough for us to enact justice. So it's something about the multiplicity or the myriad of things that we need to hold and nourish and keep close to us to fire, to enact the world, I suppose, that the world we want to see. I'm just keeping an eye on time, and I think we've kind of come toward the end of the time together with you. I thought maybe just in closing, maybe, and just in recognition of, like Caoimhe was saying, of those that are with us in this space tonight, at least live with us. Maybe some final words from each of you that kind of maybe to them in terms of, like Caoimhe said, people who are maybe involved in kind of activist work, or maybe not necessarily identifying as activists, but are seeking to deepen their work for social justice or to get more involved in movements for social justice. What might you say, if anything, and then we could close out. So yeah.
Okay, will I give up? I think it's something that it came to me when you were speaking there, Caoimhe, and I think it's we've been referring a lot to the work that needs to happen, the practice of working on yourself, and I think kind of when I'd be someone who believes politically and the ideology around actually systems of oppression, that there are systems that are oppressing people, and one of the ways they manifest is inside us and how deeply ingrained they are within us, and the exercise of dismantling those structures within us is that practice that is never ending, because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and it's just there, present all the time. But I think one of the big lessons for me in the last couple of years that I found really useful is to challenge myself and not see things in a binary way. So good, bad, easy, hard, all those kind of binaries, which I think actually are part of those systems, because those systems work in binary. You did well, or you failed, or you succeeded, or and the same way as understanding gender or understanding it's just like this binary. And one thing that I found very useful, instead of looking at things in binary, is actually looking at duality. And so, for example, the shadow and light duality. So when you are in shadow, what keeps you going is remembering how it was when you were in the light. And when you are in the light, what keeps you going is the lessons you've learned when you were in shadow, and how strong you were, and celebrating your strength. So kind of, you can't have one without the other, and that it's okay to float, and joy doesn't mean happiness, and we're not there to actually, it's sadness and grief, and staying in it is part of it, and actually just going with and being very present. So if there was one thing that I could, and that I'd like to share with all of you, is actually maybe to kind of start really challenging and dismantling anytime you catch yourself going into binary thinking, and go, let me go into that fluidity of duality. What is the duality? What am I learning from this when I'm in here? And when I'm in here, what am I keeping from when I was there? because that's what I knew. I found that very useful for me. So I hope it could be useful for some of you.
I just offer sort of sometimes I visualize when the work seems lonely, less so these days because the dissonance is less. But I oftentimes envision us all in these little sort of wooden boats out in this very dark sea with stars on the horizon, and each boat having a lantern. And just visualizing almost that sound of the oars, just like rowing and rowing through, and pausing when you need to pause, and just allowing yourself to be drifted, or sort of brought by tides and movement, and then rowing. And in those moments of sort of sometimes, and generally it's when I'm up at 4 a.m., trying to respond to a WhatsApp message box that just contains so many missives of grief and suffering and need because of injustice, from people who are on the move. But I oftentimes visualize, all of those other boats of all of these other people engaged in this work by necessity or by choice, people making these journeys that may seem lonely, and yet there's so much light, there's so much, I think, potential and community within that. And in terms of people who are in this room, I just say, be well, be well, be well. And yeah, be well within all of this, because I think there's a lot of potential for, just for suffering. Sometimes there's also, I think, a bit for profound meaning, and community, and we mentioned joy and love, and a freedom. I think that it's a really precious gift in life. I think when you can lean into your individual and collective power and hold that, because it's something that, as Amel mentioned, in the same way that once you witness injustice or suffering, you can't unsee that. But I think once you witness and see that collective and individual power, there there is no snuffing out of that. It's deep, and it grows, and just becomes stronger, I think, and more true, more prescient almost as the years go on as well. But be well.
I suppose I'd like to conclude on what I was speaking on before, and to reiterate what Amel said. I think just to recognize that self-love is not an indulgence, it's a discipline, and it's one that's necessary for community healing and collective care, and just acknowledge it and have it as a mantra.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you, to all of you together. Thank you.